As I mentioned in the introduction section, before we can talk about courage and risk-taking, we need to talk about some thinking principles and some analytic principles before we get to that point. Now, don't get me wrong, that analytics principle is not about spreadsheets or big data. It really is about some kind of thinking and internal processing that goes on before you begin taking risks or being courageous in your actions. So let's talk about one thing, and let's start off talking about how leaders many times think about an issue or a problem. That approach is called linear thinking, where a problem is identified and then a solution is identified, and that straight line across between those two data points is very flat and linear. Problem, solution, straight line across. Now, again, for years and years, that's how many leaders have banked their worth, is through that type of approach. Identify an issue, create a solution, end. I want to introduce a couple of different ways to look at things. The first one of those is going to be something called critical thinking. Critical thinking indeed was born the first time that somebody said the words, what if? What if we made this big giant rock round? What if we moved out of the trees and into the caves? That was critical thinking. If you think about the word critic for a minute and further think about a movie critic or a book critic or something like that, what they do is they point out the failings and the flaws in what they're reviewing. Well, critical thinking in a leadership context is exactly the same. Critical thinking is looking at the way something is being done now and identifying, gosh, we can do that better. There are different approaches to that. We can look at different angles. There's got to be a way to be more efficient. There's got to be a way to be more effective. There's got to be a way to eliminate some of this paperwork or slim down the system requirements. That's critical thinking. Now, like that movie critic and like that book critic, critical thinking in and of itself does not produce a better outcome. Critical thinking begins the dialogue to produce a better outcome. What that means, quite simply, is critical thinking will expose the flaws in a current process or a current way of doing things, but it won't create a solution. It won't make a better path. That'll come a little bit later. Now, there's one piece of caution that I have to share with you related to critical thinking. There's kind of a thin line, especially in leadership, there's kind of a thin line between good critical thinking, which is a highly valued tool and skill set, and becoming the department or company critic. Those are two very different dynamics. Critical thinking leads us down a path to a better solution, and it begins a dialogue, and we work through those things and have further discussions and develop better product and service delivery. While being a department critic or a company critic simply is pointing out the flaws, and in many cases looking for flaws when they don't exist. It's nitpicking. What happens if you get labeled as that company critic or department critic, people will no longer work with you. People will no longer seek your input or value what you're saying. They'll actually find ways to work around you instead of with you. So again, critical thinking, extremely valuable in organizations and probably should be utilized much more than that caretaker, everything is fine mentality, but avoid becoming the critic and pointing out the flaws in everything as well.